Enough monkeying around. It's been 2 months since my last episode of Addy Reviews, after which I spent some time making a series of mini reviews on this channel, but enough monkeying around. Yes, that is a pun. I'm looking at you, Twitch chat. Told you guys I'd tag you back with a pun in the intro of my review video today. So with that said, let's get down to monkey business. Pun intended. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome back. It's me, Addy, again, and I hope you guys are doing amazing as always. I know that I definitely am, for it wasn't long ago that I got to experience my foray into the beautiful realm of Chinese mythology for the very first time with Black Myth Wukong, the latest and greatest action-adventure game in town that a lot of people were looking forward to. And I mean, a lot. Like, if you don't believe me, believe the statistics, which reflect its peak player count of over 2 million on Steam, and the fact that it dethroned the mighty Elden Ring as the highest played single-player title on the platform. And it's only when you journey through Wukong that you begin to understand these record-breaking numbers, and by extension, the overwhelmingly positive reception that this game garnered. And that's because you realize first and foremost that Wukong is a love letter. And it's a love letter to one of the great works of Chinese literature, that being Journey to the West. And despite never reading it, on top of being virtually alien to Chinese mythology, I was still able to infer that this game was incredibly resonant amongst audiences in China, mainly due to its beautiful and delicate illustrations of their folklore. The creatures, stories, and dynamics present in this experience are delivered at a scale so vast, with a knowledge of the material so intimate, which all makes sense given that this game was developed in China itself and is in fact the first AAA game to come out of the country. Created by developer Game Science, a small but clearly passionate team of people who spent 6 long years, the title pays homage to the grand exploits of its titular character, the Chinese Monkey King Sun Wukong, who, as soon as you begin the game, jumps onto a flying cloud within a highly cinematic sequence that is reminiscent of the newer God of War games, which Game Science themselves, by the way, have said heavily inspired this game. Also, quick side note, yes, that is a bipedal being with a staff and a tail standing on a tiny cloud. Yes, I called a cloud the Flying Nimbus many times on my playthrough. Yes, Sun Wukong inspired everyone's favorite character, Son Goku. And yes, if you're a fellow Dragon Ball fan, you owe it to yourself to play this goddamn game. Side note over, sorry about that. So Wukong flies straight into battle against an emissary of the Celestial Court, which is basically heaven, since they don't approve of everyone's beloved mischievous monkey wanting to live life as a peaceful mortal monkey instead of a supreme Buddha monkey. And after an epic cataclysmic fight that you, the player, get to partake in with Wukong at his full might, the Monkey King, sadly, is defeated and sealed away in a rock atop Mount Huaguo, where eons later, one of his descendants is chosen to seek out 6 relics across the land in order to resurrect him. And that's pretty much the first 5 to 6 minutes of the game. That's right, this might come as a shocker to you, but you don't actually play as Wukong himself beyond this game's intro. You actually play as this descendant of his, or the Destined One as the game calls him, who is a mute protagonist. A stark contrast to the chirpy Monkey King. And on top of this, something I wish I knew that I'll impart to you folks is that this game isn't actually a depiction of Journey to the West. Rather, it's an imagined sequel to Journey of the West. The Wukong you play as in this game's intro is one who's actually already been through all the trials and tribulations of the story, in which he accompanies his Buddhist teacher and fellow pupils on a pilgrimage to India. And while I was admittedly a little saddened when I learned of this, for I realized that I of course wouldn't get to experience Journey to the West here, which I had wanted to for a long time, I nevertheless found myself thoroughly captivated by the game and its story from start to finish. And that's a good thing. So as the Destined One, you journey through 6 distinct biomes, each within their own chapter that thematically corresponds to a particular period and adventure in Wukong's life. And through this, you encounter several friends and foes from his past, and by extension, the novel. This does naturally make way for a lot of esoteric conversations where characters will reference things that may leave you confused if you're not well versed with Chinese mythology or Journey to the West itself. I know that I felt puzzled about several aspects of this game's narrative barring the basic premise, but this wasn't inherently a bad thing. And that's because, in spite of these cryptic elements, the beauty of the game lies in its enrapturing presentation of them. where the characters, locations, and grand set pieces remain incredibly fascinating, especially for someone like me who once again knew next to nothing about Chinese mythology. Even with my minimal knowledge and comprehension of the lore, seeing the richly designed creatures and anthropomorphic animals, many of whom appear as engaging enemies and bosses, was unbelievably cool. And I found this experience both enriching and mesmerizing, especially during the final sequences of each chapter, which culminate in these stunning animated short films and beautiful tapestries depicting epic mythical battles with detailed explanations that add depth before you move on to the next chapter. And it helps that there's some really touching and indelible music that accompanies all of this. For those of you out there who've played the game, man, you'll know what I'm talking about. That Chapter 4 ending theme still lives rent-free in my heart. It's so good. And the Chapter 2 loot music, which is a totally different vibe, but a banger nonetheless, lives rent-free in my head. Good thing I have a head. So aesthetically, I adored this game. There's no doubt in my mind that the visual component of Black Myth Wukong stands out as its greatest strength, especially thanks to the stunning photorealistic graphics made possible by Unreal Engine 5. This was my first time playing a game that uses UE5, and despite a few minor performance hiccups that can be attributed to the engine, the visual fidelity is breathtaking here. The realism and the intricate details of every nook and cranny, particularly in the rocky and grassy environments, is simply astonishing. And the lighting is among the best I've seen in any game. And I say this having never touched the ray tracing setting a single time on my playthrough. Okay, alright, I think I've gotten everything I wanted to say about my favorite aspect of Wukong out there. I haven't even touched on the gameplay yet, which I probably should have done a little minute ago. I mean, that's how these reviews go, right? You talk about the gameplay because it's a video game, gameplay most important thing, right? All that sort of stuff. But, you know, it is what it is, all right? My rules, my review, monkey see, monkey do. All right. Let's move on to the gameplay, shall we? So even if you haven't played this game yet, chances are you've heard of all the Souls-like comparisons from the grapevine, on top of a lot of folks who may have suggested that this is not in fact a Souls-like. And I largely agree with that, but I'd add that we still can't deny how much this ultimately does feel like a Souls-like, barring maybe just one or two defining aspects of the genre that aren't present here, of course. While you don't have the brutality of, upon death, losing any of your currencies that you use to level up, buy upgrades, and more, you do still have recognizable traits in this experience, like having resting spots or checkpoints, which are known as shrines in this game, as well as wide linear levels with plenty of secrets and challenging mobs will respawn if you rest or travel away. Of course, the keyword there is challenging. This game, while appearing easy on the surface due to a good portion of the first two chapters being relatively placid compared to what you may be accustomed to from most Souls-likes, begins to pull absolutely zero punches the further on you progress. While a majority of the basic mobs, even towards the end of the game, don't get too crazily difficult at any point, the bosses are a completely different story. Oh god! Oh man. Oh my god. Oh, well, it finally happened. It had to happen at some point. It had to happen at some point. That death. Listen, I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that some of the bosses beyond the second chapter in this game gave me a significantly harder time than some of the Souls-like, or hell, Soulsborns themselves that I've played in recent memory. Like, without going into spoilers, I swear to God, the final boss of this game raised my heart rate to a level that was way higher than when I was fighting the final boss of Elden Ring's DLC. In fact, I think I died more times in Wukong than I did with the DLC, at least according to my death counter. Yeah, that's how much Wukong made me personally sweat at the end of the day. Dirty motherfucker, let's go! Let's go! Oh my god. Oh, my heart has never... Oh, my heart is pounding, man. Can't remember. Not even Elden Ring's DLC, brother. Not even the fucking Radon fight at the end can make my heart beat this fast. Oh, Ring of Fire, please start an OnlyFans. I will literally sub to an OnlyFans for the first time in my life. Oh my god. Oh. Breathe. Breathe. I'm not even kidding, man. My heart rate is through the roof right now. I should have streamed this bitch with a heart rate monitor. Please, no more. Let that be it. Let that be it. Please. I've seen clips of other streamers breezing past a lot of the challenges that gave me trouble in this game. And honestly, that's kind of cool to see, since that reaffirms the fact that these Souls-likes, or at the very least, Souls-adjacent games, challenge different folks, well, differently. I've seen some consider Sekiro to be the hardest out there, while others found that kind of straightforward, and instead thought that Lies of P challenged them the most. Me personally, I think that this game is one of the hardest. I couldn't tell you what I'd consider to be the most difficult, but this one is absolutely up there. And one of the chief reasons for that, amongst the slew of insanely punishing attacks that the bosses throw at you, is because of how integral dodging is to the game. That's right, this game is to dodging what Sekiro is to parrying. In that game, it's all about perfectly timing your blocks to tucker out your opponent and eventually defeat them. Whereas in this one, it's about perfectly dodging your opponent's attacks to then build up what's called focus points in order to retaliate with a devastatingly powerful attack. And if you know me, you know that I'm a sucker for parrying and generally thrive in environments where that's the integral combat mechanic. For my fellow parrying pals out there, Wukong sadly does not have that mechanic as baked into the experience as you might have hoped. Even though you do get moves that make it seem like you can pull off parries, such as this insanely cool looking staff spin you can do to destroy enemy projectiles, as well as build up focus faster, you can't actually block in this game at all, at least with your basic kit. You do get a spell amongst a couple other really cool ones that allows you to turn into stone and pull off a pseudo parry if you perfectly time it to an enemy's attack, but it's not quite on the same level since it ultimately does cost mana to use, and once again isn't baked in as a core mechanic. So even though you do have this move as a crutch, you still nevertheless have to respect that this game's all about getting better at dodging your enemy's attacks at the end of the day. And this was something that I found really difficult personally. It might come easy to you, might not come easy to you. It's different for different folks like we were talking about earlier, but for me, it was quite tough. But regardless, I still had a hell of a good time getting better at it, especially since pulling off a perfect dodge is absolutely as satisfying as pulling off a perfect parry, in my opinion. And as a whole, the combat in Black Myth Wukong is satisfying. Harkening back to this game's exquisite presentation and attention to detail that I was talking about earlier, the action in this game falls right under that. Fights are fast-paced, frenetic, and deeply devoted to Eastern martial arts techniques, all of which are mesmerizingly showcased in the Destined One's attack patterns and animations. As well, the sound design is a nice touch here. I loved hearing my character's primal yells, or monkey noises if you will, as he struck foes and put some muscle into each swing of his staff. That sounded really adorable, I'm not gonna lie. And similar to the newer God of War games, you have several skill trees where you can invest points earned from defeating enemies and leveling up. Most of these skill trees impact how the Destined One battles with his staff, which features 3 unique fighting stances. And while these stances don't change the basic attack animations, they do affect how light and heavy attack combos are executed, as well as how power attacks are unleashed when you charge up enough focus. I thought that this was a pretty neat subversion from most action-adventure games. The fact that power attacks are given more emphasis here and the way in which these attacks engage with enemies is super cool. For example, one of your stances is known as the pull stance, which, as you might have guessed, is pretty much Kid Goku's power pole extension from Dragon Ball. And by extension, no pun intended, my favorite stance in the game. You perch yourself higher and higher while charging focus until you reach your highest point, from where you can unleash a powerful downward attack on your enemy's noggin. And besides these fighting stances, you get skill trees to improve things like your HP, mana, stamina, as well as spells that require mana that you'll unlock as you progress through the story. Now, we already touched on one of these, which is the rock solid stance, allowing for these sort of parry attacks, but there are some other really fun ones to use, like my personal favorite, which is immobilize, that allows you to freeze enemies and get some hits in before they're, well, mobile again. And Pluck of Many, which allows you to summon a squad of monkey clones to help you take down the big bads, since ape together strong. But sometimes, you don't gotta be an ape, or monkey, since this game allows you to transform into a plethora of different creatures, all of whom are the spirits of optional mini-bosses you'll be defeating on your travels. And I really liked this aspect of the game. It added so much. Some of these spirits are simpler ones, allowing you to deal unique one-hit attacks during which you transform and de-transform in the blink of an eye, while others have more staying power and deeper combat mechanics. With so many different fighting styles and elemental attacks, these spirits offer a wealth of gameplay variety when it comes to the combat, as well as incentive to search out more secret bosses to be able to literally play as them and use their attacks, which I could really appreciate. So yeah, the combat mechanics in this game and the way they derive themselves from the overarching aesthetic are wonderful. And it was real nice to top all of this off with beautiful armor sets and stabs so you could craft throughout the experience, each one looking better than the last. And having rare items and ingredients to find in each level that you could then turn into specific vendors to give you permanent stat boosts and more. Stuff like this made the game rewarding to play, and it really felt like the more time I invested into exploring optional areas and taking on tough bosses, the more value I'd get out of it. And the game had an impressive amount of optional content. I was pleasantly surprised at just how many branching paths each level had. In fact, at times I felt overwhelmed and really hoped that I was choosing the right path, aka the optional path, as opposed to the main one, since I generally love taking on as much optional content as possible before continuing the main story. The third chapter of the game in particular felt the most like this, and is where I think a lot of the replayability comes in. I certainly will jump back into this game someday to check in with the stuff I missed, because I am more than confident that there's a lot of stuff that I did, and that you will too on your first playthrough. In fact, there was stuff that I missed on my first playthrough that I went back to get on my first playthrough itself, since it was almost a necessity for getting past certain bosses in this game. This is something I didn't entirely love, since had my Twitch chat not informed me of certain key items that I need for beating two bosses in particular, I never would have figured it out on my own and would have had to spend thrice the time getting past them in the most brutal conditions possible. The game doesn't make it clear at times that certain things that are optional and secret are important to find, and I honestly feel like some of these shouldn't be optional or secret. Except for some things though. Like this guy here. I'm gonna tell you right now, don't break his jars, bro. Don't break his jars. Oh, I can start moving for that. Oh no. What have I done? Okay, then. What do you mean? He totally said break my jars. Please break my jars in all caps. I won't stand for this misinformation in my chat. I wasn't lying. The bosses in this game can be pretty brutal, like Souls-like levels of brutal, which we established. But whereas those games are difficult as a whole, since every one of their systems beyond just the fights pose a challenge, Wukong takes a different approach, where some of its components outside of the boss battles offset their difficulty, and I appreciated that leniency. As one example of what I'm talking about, as we established earlier, you don't lose anything upon death in this game. In addition to this, you can respec your character whenever you want at absolutely no cost. At first, I thought that this would make the game too easy when I realized you could do this, but in no way, shape, or form was that the case. I respect more times than I can count in this game, and still had to sweat my butt off to come out on top at the end. But I loved that, since every boss in this game, especially given how gimmicky they were, influenced me to reshape my build to beat each specific one. In a weird way, it almost felt like I was assembling a jigsaw puzzle, with how I was putting together different perks after each unsuccessful attempt against a boss to eventually craft the perfect build to defeat them. This was such a cool dynamic that I want to say I have never experienced before in a game. Most games allow you to go so far as changing your armor or weapon between each attempt, or going somewhere to grind and level up, but enabling you to change your whole ass build as many times as you want is kind of on another level, and I really liked that. Now, of course, there were some things here that I didn't like as much, and it had nothing to do with the bosses themselves, who were unbelievably freaking cool in every way from start to finish, from their designs to their attacks and the threat they posed. All of it was just
perfect.
The one thing that wasn't
Perfect
was a byproduct of them being
perfect.
Okay, I'll stop that. Sorry. And what I mean by that is that this game had some pacing problems. And not in terms of the story, which that grievance usually applies to, but the gameplay. In a really weird way, Black Myth Wukong feels like a boss rush. And because of how many there are in this game, it feels like around every single corner you're fighting a new boss. And while that's really cool and all in the beginning, it does start to admittedly become rather fatiguing in the latter half of the game, where you're fighting some intensely grueling foes back to back to back who give you almost no room to breathe in between them. Interestingly, the third chapter of this game gets a bit of flack from folks for going on a little too long. Funnily though, I never saw that as an issue myself, and I actually quite liked that, since there was a lot of space between each major battle in Chapter 3, where I got to explore, find secrets, and ultimately avoid burnout. And what this made me realize was just how much I underappreciated the pacing of Souls-like games, where with the exception of one or two bosses in the experience, there were large swaths between them to immerse myself in. But in Wukong, this largely wasn't the case, and it kinda got to the point eventually where instead of feeling euphoric upon defeating some of the bosses I found to be the hardest, which is an aspect of playing these games that I love, I was just relieved that it was over, and it kinda sucked feeling that way, if that makes any sense. I'm just glad it's over, dude. About time. So yeah, I would say that pacing is ultimately the largest issue that I have with Black Myth Wukong. Also notice some smaller pain points which are worth mentioning here as well. One of them being the fact that the game had its fair share of bugs, most of which had to do with the bosses, once again. How many additional ones, dude? Is that it? That better be it. Get down here. You're up there still. Come down here. The hell is this shit? Is she bugged? She's bugged. All right, ma'am. If you're not gonna come down here, I'm gonna come up there. Or not. I'm telling Dad. I'm telling your dad. I'm telling on you. Tell your daughter to get down here. There was even a bit of funkiness with the basic enemies, where sometimes they disappear and spawn back at their default positions at full HP, even though they barely moved from where they were while fighting me. But I would say the second biggest issue next to the pacing was the level traversal. I have to reiterate, I think the levels looked gorgeous. Once again, the presentation was immaculate in this game, but physically working through them wasn't the best. I didn't like the fact that this game had way too many invisible walls, and it wasn't the fact that this largely outdated element of game design was here that irked me, as much as the fact that it bred inconsistency within the game's own rules. I'll explain what I mean. There are times in this game where it looks like you can walk to a certain location or hop off a certain ledge, but an invisible wall blocks your path. This then creates scenarios where you think to yourself, surely I can't walk over there or fall over there because there's probably an invisible wall like I've seen before. But turns out there actually isn't, and next thing you know, an enemy knocks you off a bridge. Folks, at the end of the day though, Wukong is a great game. And to circle back to the beginning of this video, it really makes sense why this game smashed the records it did and is loved by so many. For a first crack at a game of this caliber, Game Science should be more than proud of themselves. And I assure you that you'll feel the same way too, especially since you'll see the love, care, and passion that they've imbued this project with. And this is why, in spite of the issues this game may have, I am more than happy with what I experienced here. And I'd say that Game Science succeeded in their mission of delivering a quality experience that exposes more of the world to the richness of Chinese folklore. And by the by, there's been news of an upcoming expansion as well as a planned series of games to which this serves as the genesis. and that fills me with great excitement. Considering how good of a job Game Science did with the first one here, it is genuinely fun as hell to think about how awesome the next one is going to be. So I'd say that if you're into these really difficult but rewarding action-adventure games, or just want to immerse yourself in a wonderful homage to Chinese mythology, or both, like me, then I would say that Wukong is a game that you should probably check out at some point. I mentioned this a couple times throughout my stream through of the game, but the inception and outcome of Black Myth Wukong really reminded me of that of Lies of P by NeoWiz Games. Prior to these amazing experiences, both of their respective developers were relatively unknown, but came into the scene swinging, both years back to back. And I'm kinda hoping that this becomes a trend. Like, I don't know about you guys, but I'm really digging this so far. I also dig the fact that there are some of you out there that made it to the end of this video. So with that said, thank you so much as always for checking out my review video today, folks. If you want to catch my full playthrough of Black Myth Wukong, then be sure to head over to my second YouTube channel, that's Irritable Archives, where I store all the VODs of my Twitch streams. And if you want to stop by and say hi while I'm streaming, then look no further than twitch.tv/irritableindian, of course, where I'm currently streaming on Fridays and Saturdays at 9:30 p.m. Eastern. By the time this review video's up, I probably will have done 2 additional streams of Wukong despite having already rolled the credits, and that's because it recently came to my attention that there's another ending to this game, and I'm super stoked to check that out. Don't tell anyone. We're eventually going to get around to that monkey business. But until then, folks, stay happy, stay healthy, stay positive, and as always, keep on keeping on. Ape together strong.